We should move on and talk about Zoran Mandami, who's just won a landslide mayoral election in NYC. I believe he won 50% of the vote to Andrew Cuomo's 42%, almost 42%. Zoran Mandami's campaign was sort of on the back of this idea of fixing New York's astronomically high cost of living. But we also can't ignore the fact that he's someone very involved in the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel movement. I mean, he famously really struggled to condemn the phrase globalize the intifada. I think he said he would discourage it rather than condemn it. Tom, what do you make of the fact that a man like this is now the mayor or the mayor-elect of New York City?
Well, of course, it's depressing that an individual who's a sort of combination of being incredibly unimpressive, but the things that he is really into are toxic and disgusting. But also at the same time of a great and very important city still, despite the fact that it has also been on the slide in recent years, as many Democratic-led cities in the US have been. But it's also kind of telling as to what put him over the line. I mean, we'll get all of the analysis in the coming days as to where he was strongest, but it was very clear where the momentum behind that campaign was coming from. The cost of living crisis issue was certainly front and center, but it was quite clear that in terms of polling, the people also just appreciated him as a kind of someone who's going to posture against Trump, which is seemingly one of the main qualifications for being a popular Democratic politician these days, but also the idea of Gaza, even though the New York City mayoralty can do absolutely nothing about what's going on in the Middle East. The fact that there's a generation of voters who have been radicalized in all the worst ways by this conflict saw this as an opportunity to put down a marker, and they put down that marker very much against the Jewish state and very much on the side of the Israelophobes. So that's certainly nothing to welcome. It's also clear that even with the cost of living crisis, I think it's important to understand the kind of social and class base to people who were reacting to his campaign in a big way, who were activists for him. Yes, they are affected by the cost of living crisis, those people, but it tends to be because they're people who did go to really good universities, as Zoran Mamdani did, who did come from privilege, as Zoran Mamdani did. His dad was a Columbia professor and his mum was a kind of high-flying filmmaker. But at the same time, they've got this kind of sense of irritation that their privilege doesn't go as far as it used to, that they're still having to pay astronomical rents, that they're the sorts of people who are making a very good wage in life, but they're not quite living the exorbitantly expensive lives of some of the super rich that you do still get in Manhattan. So yes, it's a cost of living crisis, and yes, that is a huge problem across New York, but at the same time, I think it's not necessarily speaking to his campaign at least, is not necessarily speaking to the working class as it is the downwardly mobile upper middle class. It's not to say that they haven't got some legitimate grievances, shall we say, but most people would probably reach for their tiny violin if you started to list them. So it's just telling that I think kind of woke millennial quote-unquote socialism, of which he is obviously a leading exponent, has not gone away. It's certainly entrenched itself. The kind of identitarian thing has now seamlessly morphed its way into a kind of third worldist anti-Israel thing as well. I think that's the kind of next stage that it's taking on. And it's going to continue to be a feature of Western politics. But it's pretty obvious to me that the constituency that it claims to speak on behalf on aren't the ones who are primarily activated by this rhetoric in this campaign.
And Benedict, what's your prognosis on Mandani?
I'll start with the sole positive that I can find, which is that this is an example of populism smashing through sort of entrenched politics. When you look at the other options that were on the table, Andrew Cuomo or Eric Adams, and you're kind of thinking, well, frankly, I think if that's the best you can do, you deserve a slap in the face. And I'm not saying that the people of New York deserve this particular brand of socialism, but you do deserve a wake-up call. And I think that that's probably what this is. You can't keep doing what the Democratic Party has been doing for a long time, which is putting on the same tried and tested individuals and going, well, surely they've got to vote for one of them at some point, because this is how it works, right? This is how dynasties work. No, that's not how it works at all, and they should have learned that lesson. Of course, with Donald Trump, multiple times, people will eventually snap. Now, just because they haven't snapped the way that we particularly like them to, doesn't mean that this isn't a sign that things ultimately might change. That can be positive. In this case, I don't think it particularly is positive, obviously because of the growing influence, I think, of third worldism, but also anti-Semitism in American life. And the difficulty with that is, I'm under no illusions here. I didn't believe that before October 7th all was well and dandy and that there wasn't anti-Semitism. I think it was probably more in the United States than there was here. But it's obviously been given an out. It's been given an outlet. It's been given a route to sort of manifest itself. And it's not explicitly on the left in the United States at all. We're seeing this a lot more on the Republican Party as well, is that suddenly it is acceptable. It's almost fashionable to be, at the very least, aggressively anti-Israel. and your reasons for it can be multitude. That's one of the things about anti-Semitism, that it is a many-headed hydra. But that is obviously coming to the fore, and of course we can go back actually to the last presidential election when Kamala Harris had two options for vice president, and she chose the one who was less impressive but wasn't Jewish. And why didn't they pick the Jewish one? Well, very obviously because they thought it would cause issues around anti-Semitism in the party. That is the direction I think that the Democratic Party is going, and also, frankly, in New York, it's this sort of quite, as I say, you used the expression though, well, you did as well. If you look at the shifting demographics in New York right now, it's not inconceivable that actually Hispanics will outnumber white people at some point in the next, possibly even this year, actually, given the rate at which that demographic is changing. Now, that's slightly unbelievable, given that if you're thinking about the United States, which, let's be clear, is a very racialized society, you can't get away from that. When you think of New York, who do you think of? Predominantly, you think of Jews, you think of Italians, you think of maybe then Irish. To think that basically those three will be overtaken by Hispanics, which is not necessarily, the demographic that carries lots of anti-Semitism, but it shows you how much these major cities are changing. And it shows you also, frankly, why you are beginning to get this real sort of insurgency within certain cities across the United States. I think everybody knows about places like Portland and California, obviously, but you're seeing now a far greater division, which is becoming a lot more entrenched. Trump's victory did not usher in a new era of sort of Republican resurgence. They've been a lot more hands-on than they were first time around under Trump, but I think actually a lot of the resistance to them has become a lot more fierce. And the thing that obviously worries us all about the United States is politically a lot more polarized, racially a lot more polarized, and they've all got guns. And this is the thing, when we talk about the prospect of civil war in the United Kingdom, I always do sort of slightly throw up my hands and go, well, I just don't see where that starts. I mean, hypothetically, there's a scenario, but we're a long way off here. But the one thing that kind of really cuts us off here is actually you're not able to just go out and buy weapons en masse. Whereas in the United States, that is a fundamental part of their culture. And so I do think, generally, we see these trends, and on the one hand, we have to go, it's good that establishment politics is being given a real bloody nose. But at the same time, the direction that it's going in, certainly in the Democrat side, is not particularly optimistic.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, we've got to move on, George, but just quickly, it's interesting as well that this kind of signals the last gasp of a kind of populist left in the US that was at least critical of the kind of more identitarian or ugly anti-Israel sort of sentiments, that kind of particular strain which has cropped up on university campuses and whatnot, particularly over the course of the past couple of years. Because people are kind of presenting this as the kind of continuation of the Bernie Sanders revolt or what have you. I think in many respects it's quite different to that. It's one that is very in with identity politics in a way that the Sanders campaign was actually quite critical of it. It used to get criticised by the kind of Black Lives Matter lot for insisting on speaking in broad class-based terms and not wanting to kind of divide up the electorate. There's also, I think, a kind of recognition that whether or not they want to admit it or not, certainly at any kind of national poll, they're not going to win over the working class. So you just double down on the constituencies, the kind of combination of sort of people who are sort of upper middle class, people with cultural clout, the hipsters, plus the people at the very bottom who are still going to be voting for the Democrats for quite obvious reasons. And that is a shift which I think is only for the worse. I think the kind of millennial socialist left, whether it was embodied by Mamdani or the kind of Corbynista momentum movement, are a group of people who are both malign and irritating, and the fact that they're going to continue to be hanging around as a permanent feature, it seems like, of Western politics in this country as well as in the US, is depressing. But it's telling that I think that that constituency was always there for it. So obviously they were just looking for an outlet.